How long are the answers do you want? Everybody's going to say what they always say in these things. You don't sound like you do in the podcast, but when you're doing a long monologue like a storyteller, you get into a different kind of mood. Answering questions, if I sounded like I did in the podcast, you'd sound insane. You give me the hook.
It's hardcore history.
I'm going to lead you through the last moments of Flight 1015. Okay, I know what this is. It's a dead giveaway when you give the flight number, right? This is me in the remake of The Twilight Zone and the remake of Nightmare at 30,000 Feet, I think it's called.
I'm Rodman Edwards, the host of Enigmatique, and I'm going to lead you through the last moments of Flight 1015.
This is something I was really happy to be involved in because we've always said that the Hardcore History Show has Twilight Zone elements. When Jordan Peele decided to do the latest remake of The Twilight Zone, they wrote an episode that was a redo of one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes, one of everybody's favorite Twilight Zone episodes, the one with William Shatner and the gremlin out on the wing. And so they asked me to do this podcast, and the host of the podcast's name is Rodman Edwards. Well, Rodman Edwards is sort of the name of Rod Serling. When you hear somebody thinks that they want to sort of voice for a podcast in a TV show that they think sounds like a voice for a podcast should sound like, and they come to you, I just think that's a really nice compliment. Somebody said something to me once early on, and they said to me, you know, you need to think about it a little differently. It's not always how many people are listening. Sometimes it's who they are. Tom Hanks, when we had him on one of our Hardcore History Addendum shows, started off, and I'd never met him and never spoken to him, started off with just so many compliments, and you don't even know how to respond because it is so overwhelmingly cool. And all you want to do is just compliment him back because, you know, Tom Hanks, right? But there's a lot of that, and I'm not the only podcaster who's had that experience. Part of it, I think, is the international audience. And I always said when I was doing radio in Oregon, if I did a show about Iran, for example, and I got something terribly wrong, I get 1 or 2 letters from some Iranian expatriates who live nearby. If I say something about Iran now and get it wrong, I'm going to get 1,000 letters from Iran. I hold within the folds of my toga both peace and war. Which should I let drop? Oh boy, sounds a little Julius Caesar-y, doesn't it? But this is going to be Death Throes of the Republic, right? Oh no, it's going to be Punic Nightmares then. Okay, wrong. This was the first multi-part show that we ever did. Hannibal's fascinating because supposedly this is a guy who was raised to hate Rome from like babyhood. And if that's true, you think about how crazy it is, like you're polluting this young person's mind and sort of setting him on this course that will eventually lead to his death and everything else, and the deaths, hundreds of thousands of people at least. And then there's the fact that he's this great general. So a lot of great generals had really great armies. And so you try to tease out whether or not the, victories are their fault or the fact that they had this incredible military force. Hannibal's fighting against better armies. And so when you try to rank generals throughout history, Hannibal has to be way up there because he's going against armies that are better than his and beating them time and time again. We did a show called Apache Tears once, which was the first one we ever did that was over an hour long. And you got to remember, this is early days of podcasting, and that seemed like a violation of the listener's rights. And so if you go listen to Apache Tears, the very first thing you hear is an apology from me for making a podcast that was over an hour long. And the listeners wrote back and said, we have pause buttons. And there was this light bulb going on over my head moment where you go, oh yeah, they do. And maybe they don't care about length. And then you would get into the middle of these stories, which I never plan out, and there's no scripts. So it's sort of a leap before you look, organizational style. And then you find yourself in the middle of the story. You go, well, we're nowhere near the end. What am I supposed to do? Do you make a 20-hour podcast, or do you start splitting it up? And, well, eventually we did both. But, splitting it up was our choice. You're called the masters of the world, but there's not a foot of ground that you can call your own. Okay, I know what this is from, too. This is going to be from Death Throes of the Republic. And this refers to the fact that Roman legionaries who'd fought in the wars didn't have the opportunity to then come home and get a hold of a farm where they could raise a family and do all that kind of stuff. And this is all part of the context of the time period where the social pressures were building up there. We would today call it the, growing divide between the haves and the have-nots, or the rich and the poor. And these are the soldiers who are, creating this entire empire that everyone's getting rich on, and yet they're not really sharing in the spoils. And that became a wonderful sort of thing that demagogues or people like that could use as a tool to get these soldiers on their side, right? You're going to conquer all this territory. You're going to lose all your lives. You're going to have yourself crippled. Why aren't you sharing in what you're conquering? It's really the only difference from the time period we have now. If we end up with these demagogues in our society, pitting Americans against one another, the difference between our situation and the Roman Republic situation is our demagogues don't have the armies. And this is how you get the armies, by pointing out how wrong they've been. And, you follow me and get me into office and we'll fix that wrong. I think there's a lot of things people find fascinating about the collapse of the Roman Republic. Start with the fact that there are real echoes that sound like today. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that, when you have human beings in the story, things always feel a little similar. There's that wonderful line that history doesn't repeat, but it always rhymes. And it sometimes rhymes because we're in it. And when human beings are in it, there's all the things that make us special. There's love, greed, corruption, self-sacrifice, all the things that make up humanity. Then you add to the fact that there are similarities in terms of the system. So you have another republic, right, with elected representatives and all that entails, from the corruption to the favors to the demagoguery. And I think that right there, if you're an American, you see the similarities and find it interesting. But I think all over the world it's fascinating because the ruins are still all over Europe today, right? In countries far away from Italy. So there is a Roman history that is wrapped up in the DNA of a ton of different European societies. The reason that you have all these Romance languages in all these different countries is because Rome was there once, mixing its arcane form of Latin with local dialects. The Roman Republic's fall is absolutely psychotic in a way, and yet if history does teach lessons, and all the experts are pretty sure it doesn't, but if it does, the Roman Republic looks like a giant flashing, warning sign. Now with you asking me all these questions about Rome, I'm thinking about Julius Caesar. What I like about Caesar, and remember, when you're talking about ancient people, you never know. We're going from these sources and stuff, and there's so much propaganda around these people, and people who love them, and people who hate them. I always say there's an MSNBC version of history and a Fox News version of history, and you never know which one you're getting. But Julius Caesar sounds like he was this crazy intellect that you then give a lot of power to. And a lot of times the crazy intellect people don't seek power and don't want power. So they're often on the sidelines critiquing current events. And I always think to myself, God, wouldn't it be great to have some super genius leader who could get us out of all of our problems, whatever those problems might be. But Julius Caesar, if you believe some of the sources, sounds like one of these guys. Also an epileptic, apparently, too. So you add all these different qualities to him, but he's the kind of guy that they say could dictate 3 sort of letters at once while sitting in a litter, directing, and a polymath and all those kinds of things. So, I mean, when you think about people, I like the idea of somebody with a super genius level of intellect being in a position to do interesting things. This is why I could never be a historian, because a historian has to find his little area of expertise and really study it to the nth degree so that they're a full-blown expert on, Anglo-Saxon farming methods or something, which is great, except that I would change every 2 weeks to something else. All right, let's see this one. What came after them, and 24 hours later, is still coming. It's not men marching, but a force of nature like a tidal wave, an avalanche, or a river flooding its banks. I'm going to say that this is the Western reporter's rundown of what the First World War German army looked like marching through Belgium, and that would be from Blueprint for Armageddon 1 or 2. I always get interns in college and saying, can we please, I can intern for your show, I can do all the research for you and everything, and I have to explain, you can't do the research for me. That's where I find all these fun little things. And even I don't know that they're fun little things until I read them. This is what takes so long, right? You sit down and you read all these books, and when you find these things, it's like a muscle. You've developed this ability to go, aha, okay, this is something you build a piece around, right? And primary source quotes, like the one where the guy is talking about what it looked like to see these German soldiers marching through Belgium. Well, that's the sort of thing, there's nothing better than that, right? He's describing to you on the ground in real time, without knowing how things are going to turn out, what he's seeing. And he really brings you to the scene because he's a reporter who's trying to do exactly that, right? So we're piggybacking on the fact that he's trying to bring to his readers what it's like to be there, at the time, and we're trying to bring to our listeners what it's like to be back there seeing it in the past. We have certain shows that we keep in our back pocket. Most of the ones we don't know we want to do. But there's certain ones where we go, oh, someday we're doing that. And the First World War was one of them. And when it was the 100th anniversary, we thought, okay, well, now's the time to tell that story. The reason it's so important is it gets overshadowed by the Second World War because that's what movies have played on and all these kinds of things. The U.S. involvement was so much larger in the Second World War that in America we pay a lot more attention to it. But the First World War is what sets up the 20th century. And so much of what's going on in the world, even today, is ironing out the wrinkles created in the geopolitical landscape by the First World War. You know, there hadn't been a general war in Europe for almost 100 years, 99 years, I think it was. Napoleon was the last one. So you think about all the technological and military developments that can occur in 99 years, and then say, what happens when everybody gets to discover all at once how much has changed in warfare when you go and fight it, you know, the way you might have fought it decades previously, and get to find out how well or not well that works in a new, you know, military circumstance. I describe sometimes in the history show how a lot of times people are pushing history in a certain direction, but that at a certain point, it's almost like the momentum created and the impetus that gets going starts to pull like a tractor beam. And at some point, human beings lose control of the process. The First World War is the best example I can think of where people look like they're in charge of things until they're not. It's going to be a very cold winter. Okay, this is going to be John F. Kennedy after the summit with Khrushchev went so terribly in the early 1960s. And this is connected to our show that we did on the well, it wasn't about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was about the early years of trying to live with the ever-growing power of nuclear weaponry. Kennedy gets into office. He's the new young breed. And I think when you get into office and you're new and you're the new level of leadership, and he's not a baby boomer, but he's the first president sort of the baby boomer era is the way he's seen, takes over from a really old World War II general. And you get this feeling like, okay, we can do things differently. We're going to get in there. We're young. We got a lot of energy. We're going to put some new proposals forward. And he runs right into the Soviet leader, Khrushchev, who almost treats him like a baby. Kennedy walks out of that meeting with Khrushchev, and you can see his entire enthusiastic hopes have been shattered. And he realizes this is going to be a lot harder than he thought it was. And that's why he says it's going to be a very cold winter. And before things are over, they're worried it's going to be a very hot time when the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and it's Khrushchev and Kennedy nose to nose trying to avoid World War III. Blitz shows are badly named. I thought they were going to be shorter, and instead over time what they've evolved into is things that deal with concepts rather than events. So rather than like a history of the fall of the Roman Republic, a Blitz show might deal with, for example, how a society or a planet learns to deal with the ever-growing power of its weaponry, which is what Destroyer of Worlds was about. War has always been potentially an existential threat to somebody in the story. If the Mongols are coming, it could be an existential threat for you and the people who live in your city or your country or whatever. Nuclear weapons is the first time that it's an existential threat to everyone, and you don't even have to be involved in the conflict. You can be an innocent bystander. And so I think reminding us what it means to think maybe you might not wake up in the morning, which is exactly what people during the Cuban Missile Crisis who were in the halls of power thought. They were calling their wives and thinking, this might be the last phone call we ever have. Well, that's where you're really focused on what's important. The way we framed it in that show was that there was a generation that lived before nuclear weapons and that lived through nuclear weapons. That's a generation that understands the threat because they grew up without it. But everybody who's been born since that time has a metaphorical gun pointed at their head, but has had that gun pointed at their head their whole life. And the question in the show was, if you've had a gun pointed at your head your whole life, do you even notice it anymore? The show was intended to point out what that gun is, what can be done if that gun ever goes off, and if you forget it's there, how dangerous that can be. When I talk about what people should listen to, I feel like that show doesn't have to go through a whole bunch of interesting sort of gyrations to be important to us. You just have to listen to it and you know, okay, this is something that's important to know because we're still dealing with it right now. When we go off to hunt for wild game, we'll go first to drive them together for you to kill. Well, it sounds vaguely Mongolian, doesn't it? Does that make sense? Well, then it's Wrath of the Khans. I'm not sure who said it. Could be Genghis Khan, could be Subadai. But yeah, I would say Wrath of the Khans, right? Genghis Khan is sort of the high water mark or the most sort of exquisite iteration of the various nomadic steppe people cultures, which were around from basically the beginning of recorded history. So, I mean, I think the first one ever mentioned is a giant influx of these people in Assyrian times. So we're talking about biblical times. And all those people followed one another. I mean, you get Cimmerians, Scythians, Sarmatians, Huns, Turks. It's all these people that they're not the same people, but it's a similar horse-driven nomadic culture. And the Mongols were sort of, if not the high watermark of that, then, as we said, the sort of the most exquisite example of it fine-tuned and taken to its logical conclusion. And that's what made them so incredibly fantastic. And generally, those people were only problems when a great leader arose and could create giant steppe confederations, so could unite a lot of tribes. And Genghis Khan united a lot of tribes and consequently made them a force in modern history that people still have a hard time quantifying how important they were. I think that the individualism of all these people shows that there isn't one sort of quality or circumstance that makes a person, that there's innumerable number of things that can put you either in a position or have you be born with the qualities, or mix the two of them, right? Born with the qualities and in the position to find yourself in historical circumstances, right? So if you put all those people in a room at a cocktail party, I'm not sure if you'd say, wow, all these people are quite alike. I think you'd probably find that they bring different skills and qualities to the table. And one might argue that the circumstances that they excelled in might have required very different sort of abilities and strengths. As fate would have it, I'm in the midst of a very long time consuming and intensive part of the hardcore history process. Well, clearly I said this, but this is how I feel before every show. So I'm in the midst of a very time consuming and intensive part of the hardcore history process. I have no idea when I said this. This could have been yesterday. Well, I was totally wrong. Okay. Again, that could also be about every Common Sense show after we started the Hardcore History podcast. I'm going to get a T-shirt. I could just get a T-shirt that says this. This perpetually useful. Common Sense was what I used to do on the radio. So Common Sense is predated. We started in 2005, but I've been doing that since about 1993 on the radio. And the whole idea was to do something where we talked about the problems of a two-party system, where there's sort of capture in our system by these two parties, and the fact that they know there's capture, right? You can work with that if you're Democratic or Republican operatives. You know that people don't have a lot of choice. The fact that we have problems in our system that sort of require systemic reform, and that we're kind of all in this together, right? I mean, this idea that we're going to get hyper-partisan and start thinking, we're going to point fingers and one party's bad and the other party's good. And that may be true. Maybe one party is bad, the other party's good, but that doesn't really help us, right? So the show was really about the dangers of hyper-partisanism. At a certain point, I almost thought things were turning our way during the Common Sense shows, but at some point, it was like the ship thinking, it was righting itself from a list, and then it just rolled over and capsized. And so it almost seems like it's the horse has gotten out of the barn, if I can use 1,000 analogies in one answer, and it's too late to close the barn door. I don't know what you do to warn people about the dangers of hyperpartisanism when we're past any worst case scenario that I was envisioning. When I started in news, we used to have 2 confirmations for any news story, and they had to be from our people. You couldn't get a confirmation from another news outlet. Well, we're so far away from there that even the traditional news outlets, to me, look like social media reporting looked like a couple years ago. And social media reporting, to me, today looks like AI. I love history, and I love feeling like we're in the midst of something important, but there's that old line that, be careful what you wish for, or may you live in interesting times. And we live in interesting times, and it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes. Everywhere we are surrounded by dogs and sorcerers and whores and killers and the godless who love lies and commit them. Well, this might be a Prophets of Doom reference, okay? And Prophets of Doom is a story, the best way for Americans to envision this is what would have happened if a guy like David Koresh had gotten a hold of a medium-sized German city during the Renaissance and got a chance to control it for a significant period of time. This is one of those weird stories. So when we talk sometimes about stories that you knew you were going to do or that you always had in your back pocket, I had this in my back pocket, but part of what was so exciting about it was I knew most Americans had no idea that this ever happened. In a place like Germany, this is a much more well-known story. In fact, if you go to the German city of Munster today, they still have the cages that they put the corpses of the main people in this story, spoiler alert, when the story ended. And I guess the cages fell down during the bombing in the Second World War, and they put them right back up, maybe because it's a tourist attraction or whatnot. But it's a fantastic story from an era where religions of Christianity, the various different sects, were at odds with each other, where the Bible was being translated into the vernacular so regular people could read it and interpret it, and all of the various sorts of historical unravelings that things like that create. I mean, anytime you have a communications revolution, things get interesting. Gutenberg Bible, movable print, social media, and this is an example when somebody who was very religious and very sure of their religion and almost had a sense like Charles Manson feeling like the Beatles were talking to him through the music, that they were being spoken to and being told what to do, and then having the power to actually act on what they felt like they were being told what to do. It is a wild, wicked, and weird story. And what I like about it is most Americans, at least, have never heard it. It's like The Sopranos plus some homosexuality. Okay, this is probably going to be, several shows this could be, but I'm going to say the Macedonian soap opera. No. Okay, so Glimpses of Olympias. Oh, see, I said it could be many different shows. Alexander versus Hitler. Holy cow. Okay, well, the reason I get them confused is because it's all about the same thing. It's what the Macedonian, and I say Macedonian, not Macedonian, but I'm a heretic on that front. The Macedonian royal families are wonderful to pay attention to. Wouldn't have wanted to live in it, but they are, I mean, the amount of violence, civil wars, assassination, hostage-taking, homosexuality, sorcery. I mean, it's so good from an entertainment standpoint. And it's so bizarre because anytime you get into ancient history, the amount of stuff that's just off the charts weird, a lot of the stuff in the Macedonian political scene we would recognize today. But then you throw in these things that we would not recognize today. I mean, you start with Alexander the Great's mother and the snakes that she supposedly had all around her. I mean, Alexander the Great's father lost an eye, famously. Philip II was a one-eyed guy because he got an arrow shot in his eye. But I love the way the ancient soothsayers supposedly told him he was going to lose an eye. He was going to lose an eye because he was going to peek through the keyhole and see his wife, Alexander's mother, having intimate relationships with a god. And when you do that, you get your eye knocked out, the one that looked through the keyhole. So I love this stuff. The Macedonian soap opera was another one we did. And we called it a soap opera because it was like a soap opera, but you add all these other things. What inspired me to start this podcast was a conversation I had over dinner that involved my mother-in-law. I tell the same sort of stories over dinner that I tell in the podcast. And I always say in the podcast, it's a rainbow and unicorn free zone. So it was a traditionally horrible, bloody story over dinner. And I think in order to change the subject, she said, why don't you talk about this sort of stuff in a podcast? Because we were already doing the current events podcast. And so I told her, I can't talk about this in a podcast. I said, I'm not a historian. I don't have a PhD in this. I have a BA in history. I don't have a PhD. And I always say if there's one thing a guy with a BA in history knows is he doesn't have a PhD in history. And she said, I didn't know you had to have an advanced historical degree to tell stories. And that was the light bulb going on over my head sort of moment where I went, And that's when you realize it's not that you can't tell them, it's that you have to tell them a certain way. And so much of what people like about hardcore history are our attempts to figure out how a guy with a BA in history talks about history. And in the first show we did, it was only 16 minutes because we just talked about the weird stuff, right? The interesting stuff, the stuff that history majors talk about on their lunch break. But that sort of requires that you know the story, because I'm not telling the story, we're just talking about the cool stuff. And then based on listener feedback I was getting, they were saying, hey, we like that cool stuff you were talking about, but we don't know the story. And so you start to have to add context so that they can enjoy the weird stuff. And that's how the layers start to get built on the show. And so when people talk about how they like hardcore history and how layered and complex it is, they assume I went out and designed it that way, and it wasn't that way. It evolved over time with a give and take with the listenership. Same thing with the length. When they say we have pause buttons, that gives you permission to go longer. And so one of the things that evolved over time is, okay, if I need to give context, how does a guy who's not a historian give context? And so we invented things like what we call audio footnotes, where we quote historians so that you don't have to believe the guy who's not a historian. Then we started quoting historians who disagreed. Well, that opened up the door to historiography, which is traditionally one of the most boring subjects in history degree learning, and yet people love it. And so all these sorts of things are kind of, you got your chocolate in my peanut butter, serendipitous sort of developments, but they've combined to create a rather compelling show, but I can't claim full credit for it because I feel like the audience has input the whole time. Learning history is important because there's no way to understand the times you live in now without looking back and trying to figure out what happened before you got there. And I had a professor once who said that life is like being born into the middle of a television soap opera. And if you don't go back and watch the old episodes, you have no idea why this person's mad at that other person and why somebody's getting slapped in the face and who's cheating on whom and all those kinds of things. We learn a lot of names and dates, and I mean, that's the traditional knock on history education, right? You learn about something in 1492 or 1066, and then you hopefully get a good grade on the test, and then you walk away and you forget the date and never use that information again. But history is something that you can really use if you understand the parts that are important. The parts that are important are not these events that happened or this date when they happened, but how things evolve and the historical process and the context, like we were talking about earlier. Everybody's interested in history. The way you explain that to people is that history includes everything. So you just find out what they're interested in already and then point out that there's a past for that. So if you're interested in motorcycles or fashion or sports or whatever it might be, you give an assignment to a person that says, okay, you're interested in motorcycles? I want you to go find me the very first motorcycle ever built, or maybe even the precursors to it. And then I want you to find the last one that came out yesterday. And I want you to trace the development and the evolution from the beginning to the end and explain the developments, the important people that helped create those developments, and show how we go from A to Z. That teaches you how things move forward and how things sort of build upon each other in layers. And you can take that template that you used for the motorcycles you were interested in and overlay it over everything in life and have it make useful sense. So instead of forgetting a name or a date after the test is over, you can use what you learned about the evolution of motorcycles on the evolution of anything. People like history more than they think they do.